Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching, whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The day they told Lena Voss she was to be married, she was standing barefoot in the yard behind her father's feed store, wringing water from a shirt so worn it had gone see-through at the elbows. The New Mexico sun beat down like a punishment, and the dust in the air was the color of dried blood. She was 22 years old, small-boned and sharp-eyed, with hair the color of dark wheat, and a jaw that had never learned to stay still when she disagreed with something. She had been disagreeing with things her whole life, with drought, with debt, with the way men in Caldera Flats spoke over women as though they weren't even in the room. But nothing she had ever disagreed with had felt quite like this. Her father, Emmett Voss, stood on the back step with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, and he said the words without ceremony, without apology, without even the courage to look at her face when he said them. "Harlon Cade has agreed to clear the store's debt," Emmett said. "All of it. Every last dollar we owe Brixton's bank. In exchange, he wants a wife." Lena stood very still. The wet shirt dripped from her fingers. She had heard Harlon Cade's name her whole life, the way you hear about weather. Something big and approaching. Something you couldn't stop. Harlon was 41 years old, 6 feet 6 inches tall, and built like a barn that had decided to walk around. He owned the cattle ranch east of town, 3 water rights, and the only working well on the south side of the valley. He had buried 1 wife already, a quiet woman named Dora, who people said had simply faded, like fabric left too long in the sun. He had never been cruel in any way. That could be proven. He was just enormous and certain and accustomed to getting what he asked for. "You told him yes," Lena said. It wasn't a question. Emmett finally looked up at her, and she saw it in his eyes. Not guilt, not exactly, but something worse. Relief. He had already decided. He had already made the trade. She was the item being exchanged, and he was standing there with the look of a man who had unloaded a terrible weight. The feed store had been failing for 3 years. The drought had taken the farmers, and the farmers had taken their money, and the money had taken everything else with it. Lena knew the numbers. She had been keeping the books since she was 16. She knew the debt was real. She knew Brixton's bank had sent 2 letters that month alone. But she had believed, she had always believed, that her father would find another way. Because she was his daughter. Because that was supposed to mean something in this world. "It's a good match," Emmett said. The words sat between them like stones. "He's a man of property. You'll be taken care of." Lena dropped the wet shirt in the dirt. She didn't throw it. She just let it fall, the way something goes when the hand holding it simply stops believing in the effort. She walked past her father without touching him, through the back door, through the feed store with its sacks of grain and its smell of dust and animal salt, and out the front door onto the main street of Caldera Flats. The town was small enough that she could see its whole length from where she stood. The saloon, the telegraph office, the church with its crooked steeple, the road that went east toward Harlon Cade's ranch. She stood there in the white morning heat and understood that her life, as she had known it, had just been handed away for a sum of money she had not been told and had not agreed to. Inside the feed store, Emmett Voss sat down on a grain sack and pressed his face into his hands. He told himself he had done the only thing he could. He told himself Lena was strong. She would manage. She always managed. He told himself Harlon Cade was not a bad man. He told himself these things over and over, the way a man says a prayer he doesn't quite believe. But somewhere beneath the relief, beneath the practical arithmetic of debts and deeds, there was a splinter of shame working its way deeper with every repetition. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. He had given the daughter. And he had chosen to call that love. Caldera Flats had a memory the way old wood has splinters, sharp things hidden in the surface, ready to catch you when you weren't careful. The town remembered Emmett Voss before the drought, when he was a broad-shouldered man who laughed easily and kept his store so clean you could eat off the floorboards. It remembered his wife, Clara, who had died of fever when Lena was 9, and left the household tilted in a way it never quite straightened out. Emmett had raised 4 children alone after. That, and the town gave him credit for it, the way it gave credit to a man who survived something difficult. But credit was not the same as admiration, and the town had watched, quietly, as the store fell into debt, and Emmett's laughter went thin, and then stopped altogether. By the time he made his arrangement with Harlon Cade, most of Caldera Flats wasn't surprised. Survival looked different on different people. On Emmett Voss, it looked like a man willing to bargain with what wasn't entirely his. Lena's 3 brothers were named Cass, Ford, and the youngest, Trick, short for Patrick, though nobody had called him that since he was 5. Cass was 26 and already had a wife and a plot of dry land north of town that he was slowly convincing into a vegetable garden. Ford was 24 and worked at the livery stable with the focused silence of a man who preferred horses to people. Trick was 17 and still had that unfinished look of a boy who hasn't yet decided what kind of man he intends to become. All 3 of them learned about the arrangement the same way Lena did, after the fact, from their father, with the apology already baked into the explanation, so there was no clean room for outrage. Cass went tight-lipped and said nothing. Ford went to the stable and didn't come back for dinner. Trick was the only one who walked straight to Lena's room and knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he stood there with his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. He didn't have the right, Trick said finally. Lena leaned against the doorframe and studied her youngest brother. He had their mother's eyes, light green, set wide, full of feeling he didn't always know what to do with. No, she said. He didn't. There was a silence between them that held more than either of them could say. Trick looked down at his boots. What are you going to do? And Lena, who had spent the afternoon sitting on the edge of her bed looking at nothing, who had gone through every option she could construct with the precision of a woman who had been keeping accounts since childhood, Lena said, I'm going to marry him. Trick looked up sharply. But I'm going to marry him, she repeated. And I'm going to do it with my eyes open. And I'm going to find a way through it. She said it quietly, without drama, the way a person states a plan they've already committed to surviving. Harlon Cade had come to the store 3 days before the announcement, and Lena had seen him through the window without knowing why he was there. She had noticed, as she always did, how the door frame seemed to shrink when he walked through it. He was not ugly. That was the difficult thing. He had a square, weathered face and grey eyes that were watchful without being unkind, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned, through decades of being that large in a world built for smaller people, to be cautious about the space he occupied. He had spoken to her father for 40 minutes with the door to the back office closed. When he left, he tipped his hat to Lena through the window. She had not known, in that moment, that he was tipping his hat to his future wife. The engagement was announced at Sunday service, by way of Pastor Gideon reading a notice that Emmett Voss had written out on a scrap of brown paper. The congregation of Caldera Flats heard it, with the polite, sideways attention of people storing information they planned to discuss more freely later. Lena sat in the third pew with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she did not look at anyone, not even when she felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room landing on her like flies on sugar. Afterward, outside, the women of the town clustered around her, with their congratulations wrapped tight around their curiosity. Mrs. Brixton, wife of the banker, clasped Lena's hand and said, "Harlon Cade is a man of means, dear." As if that settled everything, as if that were the answer to a question nobody had thought to ask. Lena smiled, because smiling cost her less than explaining. Harlon Cade's ranch was called the Ironwood, and it sat at the eastern end of the valley like something that had always been there and always intended to stay. The main house was built from dark timber and stone hauled up from a creek bed 30 miles south, and it had a wide porch that faced the mountains and a roof so solid that in all the years it had stood, not a single leak had found its way through. The inside was clean, which surprised Lena when she went to see it for the first time. She had half expected the mess of a man living alone for years, dishes left and rugs unbeaten. But the house was tidy, if sparse. There were few decorations. There was a rocking chair near the fireplace that wore the marks of long use. There was a row of books on a shelf in the hallway, and they looked read rather than displayed. There was, in the kitchen, a pot of something simmering on the stove that smelled of sage and long hours. Harlon had met her at the gate when she rode out, accompanied by Trick, who had insisted on coming and who sat on his horse behind her, like a sentinel made of stubborn love. Harlon had taken off his hat as she approached, which was a gesture of courtesy that landed awkwardly in the vast silence of the open land around them. He was even larger outdoors, where there were no walls to scale him against, just sky and grass and the enormous quiet of the valley. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low and measured, like a man who had learned to speak carefully so as not to unintentionally boom. Lena dismounted without assistance and looked up at him, because she always looked directly at things she was afraid of. It was her one reliable armor against fear. "Mr. Cade," she said, "I'd like to see the house before I agree to live in it." He had showed her every room. He answered her questions without deflecting, without shortening her. When she asked about the water supply, he took her to the well. When she asked about the nearest neighbor, he pointed and gave her a distance. When she asked, and she did ask, directly, because she needed to, what his first wife had died of, he went very still, and then said quietly that Dora had had a sickness in her chest for 2 years before she passed, and that the doctor in Santa Fe had called it consumption, and that he had spent every dollar he could find trying to stop it. There was no performance in the way he said it, just the flat, heavy weight of a fact he had lived with. Lena looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded. She did not say she was sorry. She had a feeling he had heard sorry so many times it had lost its shape. She also noticed, in the second bedroom at the end of the hall, a cradle. It was empty, and it had the look of something that had not been moved in a long time, but had been kept clean. She didn't ask about it. Some things announced themselves with enough clarity that questions would only be unkind. She filed it away. That detail, that small wooden cradle sitting in a room that smelled faintly of cedar and absence, and she carried it with her back out to the porch, where Trick was leaning against the post, looking suspicious of everything. Harlon Cade had offered them coffee. Trick had declined. Lena had accepted. They sat on the porch in a triangle of awkward silence, and the mountains turned the color of copper in the late light, and Lena thought, "This is a place that wants something living in it." She didn't yet know whether she was willing to be that thing. The ride back to town was quiet until Trick said, "He's got kind eyes for a big man." Lena glanced at her brother. "That doesn't mean anything," she said. "It might mean something," Trick said, with the philosophical stubbornness of youth. Lena rode without answering for another quarter-mile, watching the last of the sun fall behind the mountains, listening to the dry wind move through the grass on either side of the road. "He didn't choose the debt," she said finally. "Daddy chose the debt. Harlon Cade just chose to pay it." She said it as though she were sorting facts into categories, which was exactly what she was doing. Because Lena Voss, who had kept books since she was 16 and who had watched her family's numbers go wrong for years, understood one thing above everything else. Clarity was the only currency she had left. They married on a Thursday in October, when the sky was the deep, clean blue that only comes in New Mexico after the first cold front of autumn has scrubbed the haze away. The ceremony was held in the church with the crooked steeple, and it was short because Lena had asked for it to be short. Pastor Gideon read the words he was supposed to read. Harlon said what he was supposed to say in his low, careful voice. Lena said what she was supposed to say in a voice that did not waver, because she had decided, as a matter of personal principle, that she would not perform distress for an audience that had shown up half out of sympathy and half out of curiosity. She wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, with tiny buttons up the back that Trick had done up for her that morning, with clumsy, loving fingers. The dress was white once. It had gone to ivory with age, which Lena thought was honest. Emmett Voss wept during the ceremony. He stood in the front pew and wept with the open, uncomplicated emotion of a man who had convinced himself that his grief proved his love. Lena did not look at him. She looked at Harlon Cade, who stood at the altar with his hands at his sides, big, still hands, the knuckles scarred from decades of work, and who was watching her with an expression she couldn't yet read. He looked, she thought, like a man who was aware that he had been given something he had not entirely earned, and who wasn't sure yet how to carry it. That something more careful. Something more careful. Something that looked, at a certain angle, almost like reverence. After the service, there was a small reception in the churchyard. Mrs. Brixton had organized it, which meant there were tablecloths and cold chicken and a cake that was more presentation than flavor. People ate and spoke in the circumspect way of those attending an event they haven't quite decided how to feel about. Cass stood with his wife, Nell, near the fence, speaking to no one. Ford had come, which surprised Lena. He stood a little apart from everyone with a glass of lemonade he wasn't drinking, looking at Harlon Cade with the measuring look of a man sizing up a horse of uncertain temperament. Trick stood closest to Lena all afternoon, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and he never once stopped watching the crowd, as though he expected trouble to arrive from the middle of it. It was Nell, Cass's wife, who pulled Lena aside near the end and pressed her hand and said in a low voice, "You don't have to pretend with me." Lena looked at her. Nell was a sensible woman, sharp and dark-haired, who had come to her marriage to Cass with clear eyes and had never once seemed to regret it. "I'm not pretending," Lena said. "I'm managing." Nell studied her for a moment and then nodded slowly. "There's a difference," she said. "I know," Lena said, and she did know. Pretending was the performance of a feeling you didn't have. Managing was the architecture of a life built without all the materials you'd hoped for. Lena had been managing since she was 9 years old, and her mother had gone and not come back, and she had no intention of stopping now. The wagon ride to the Ironwood at the end of the afternoon was the strangest part. They sat side by side on the wagon seat, Lena with her mother's ivory dress, gathered around her knees, Harlon driving the horses with the relaxed authority of a man who had been handling reins since boyhood. The sun was going down ahead of them, painting the road in orange and red. They didn't speak for the first mile. Then Harlon said, without looking at her, "I know this wasn't what you'd have chosen." Lena considered the statement. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Another silence. "I'll do right by you," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It was a statement of intent, simple and unadorned, the kind of thing a man says when he means it, but doesn't know yet how to prove it. Lena watched the road ahead of her and said nothing. In her chest, something that had been knotted tight all day shifted, just slightly, like a rope given a quarter-inch of slack. The first weeks at the Ironwood were a negotiation conducted without words. Harlon woke before dawn and came in from the range at dusk, and in between there was the ranch, its machinery of cattle and fences and water troughs and hired hands, which consumed him completely. He was not unkind. He was not warm exactly, but he was not unkind. He left room for her in the kitchen without being told. He did not ask her to cook or clean, as though it were her job by nature rather than by arrangement. Instead, he did these things alongside her, silently and without expectation, as though they were simply two people sharing a space and sharing the work that the space required. It was not what Lena had feared, but it was not what she had hoped for, either, in the private part of herself, where hope still lived, despite everything, stubborn and uninvited as grass through stone. She found things out about him, the way you find out about a landscape, slowly, by moving through it. He read in the evenings, seated near the fire in the worn rocking chair, with a lamp pulled close, and his big body curled over the book in a way that looked almost apologetic, as though he were ashamed of taking up so much space. He preferred silence to small talk, but when he spoke about something he cared about, the land, the cattle, the way the water table was dropping every year and what that meant for the valley, he spoke with a quiet, concentrated precision that was not what she had expected from a man of his size. She had expected bluntness. She found, instead, a careful intelligence. It didn't change what had happened, but it complicated the story she had been telling herself about him. A month in, she found Dora's things in a trunk in the cedar room. She hadn't been looking for them. She had been looking for a spare blanket, because the nights were getting cold. But the trunk was unlocked, and when she lifted the lid, she understood immediately what she was looking at. A dress, a hairbrush, a small Bible with a woman's name written in the front in delicate script, and beneath those, a set of baby clothes, still folded, that had never been worn. Lena sat on the floor of the cedar room for a long time with the trunk open in front of her. The house had told her its first big secret. Dora had been expecting a child when she died. The cradle in the end room suddenly meant something different, something heavier and more specific than general grief. She didn't tell Harlon what she'd found. She closed the trunk and went back to the kitchen and started supper, and when he came in from the range, she looked at him differently, the way you look at a stranger after you've read their diary by accident. Not with judgment, exactly, but with the unsettled weight of knowing too much too soon. He noticed. He noticed because he was, beneath all that silence and stillness, a man who paid close attention. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said, and handed him a cup of coffee. He accepted it and watched her for another beat, and then let it go, because he had learned She was starting to understand that letting things go was one of the primary disciplines he had built his life around. 2 weeks later, on a cold night when the wind was dragging itself across the plain and rattling the window panes, Harlon came in late and sat at the table and didn't move toward his supper. Lena watched him from across the kitchen. His face was doing something unusual. It was open in a way it usually wasn't, like a door someone had forgotten to close. "Lost 2 calves today," he said. "The cold came too fast." He said it flatly, reporting a fact, but his hands, wrapped around the edge of the table, were pressing hard into the wood. Lena sat down across from him. She didn't say she was sorry. She had a feeling he had heard sorry so many times it had lost its shape. She had thought that about him once before, and she thought it again now. Instead, she said, "Tell me what needs to be done tomorrow." He looked at her. Something in his face rearranged itself. "I'll show you," he said. Emmett Voss came to the Ironwood on a Tuesday in November, riding a borrowed horse because his own had gone. Lame, wearing the look of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation in his head for weeks and knows it still isn't ready. Lena saw him coming from the porch. She was mending a fence rail, which was not something that had been in her plans for the day, but which had needed doing, and so she was doing it, and she set down her tools and waited. She did not walk toward him. She let him come to her, because she needed the few seconds that took to arrange her face into something neutral. She had not spoken to her father since the wedding. She had not known, until this moment, standing on the porch of a house she was slowly making sense of, how much of her was still raw about it. He dismounted, with the stiffness of an older man pretending he wasn't an older man, and he stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his hat in his hands. He was always doing that, she noticed, holding his hat when he had difficult things to say, as though the hat were a kind of anchor, and he said, "Lena, I need to ask you something." "You should have asked me things before," she said. The words came out quiet, which was worse than if they'd come out loud. He flinched. "I know that," he said. "I know, but I'm asking now." She waited. He said, "Ford's been let go from the livery. Brixton called in the remainder of the store's note. The part Harlan's settlement didn't cover. There was a second note I didn't mention." Lena went very still. "A second note," she said. The number he told her was not large by the standards of men with ranches and water rights. By the standards of a failing feed store with no income, it was a cliff edge. Emmett stood in the cold morning air and explained it with the desperate specificity of a man who has waited too long to confess, and is now getting it all out at once. The second note had been taken out 2 years ago, before Lena had taken over the books, in a period when Emmett had believed the drought would break and everything would recover. It hadn't broken. He had let the note sit in the back of his mind, certain he would deal with it, until the bank had sent a letter, and then another letter, and now a final notice. Lena listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You arranged my marriage to cover a debt you didn't even fully tell the man you were asking for help." Emmett's face collapsed in a way that was genuinely terrible to see, not because it was unfair, but because it was so entirely earned. "I thought Harlan's payment would cover everything," he said. You thought," Lena said. 3 words with the weight of a door closing. She turned and went inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table, breathing through the anger, counting it down the way she'd learned to count down debt columns when the numbers made her want to hit something. Then she went to the writing desk in the corner and took out paper and a pen. She was writing when Harlon— "Banknote," she said, without preamble. "Banknote," she said, without preamble, without looking up. "It isn't large, But it isn't small, either. He came to ask if you'd cover it. She set down the pen. She looked at him. I am not asking you to, she said clearly. I want that to be plain. I'm telling you because you have a right to know the full shape of what you married into. What you do with it is your business. Harlon was quiet for a long moment. His grey eyes moved from her face to the paper on the desk and back. What do you want me to do? He asked. And Lena, who had not expected that question, who had steeled herself for a man who would simply announce a decision, felt something shift inside her chest again. That particular shifting she was starting to recognize as dangerous, because it meant she was beginning to trust him. I want you to be angry at him, she said. I'll handle the rest. Harlon rode into Caldera Flats, alone the following morning, early before the town was fully awake. He went to the bank first. Lena knew this because Trick told her. Trick, who had a talent for being in the right place at the wrong time, had been at the general store when Harlon had passed through, and had quietly followed him at a distance, driven by the protective instinct he had toward his sister, and the complicated respect he was developing for the man his sister had married. Harlon went into the bank. He was in there for 11 minutes. When he came out, he went to the feed store. Emmett was there, opening up for the morning, and Harlon stood at the door and spoke to him. And Trick, watching from across the street, said later that he couldn't hear the words, but that his father went white as salt within the first 30 seconds of the conversation. What Harlon said to Emmett Voss was this. He had paid the second bank note. He had paid it completely, without conditions, without negotiation. But he had made Brixton draw up a document first, a formal letter of accounting, signed and witnessed, that laid out in complete detail the full history of the store's debt, including the note Emmett had hidden from both Lena and from Harlon himself. This document was made in 3 copies. Harlon kept one. He sent one to Cass, Ford, and Trick, jointly, so that Lena's brothers would know every fact about what their father had done and not done. And the 3rd copy he brought to the store and handed to Emmett directly, because he believed that a man ought to have to hold the written record of his own choices in his own hands. I'm not doing this for you, Harlon told Emmett. Trick could not hear the words, but Lena heard them later from her father himself, who came to the Ironwood 3 days after and stood on the porch, looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. I'm doing it because your daughter is my wife, and she shouldn't have to carry what you made. Then Harlon had said one more thing, still in that measured, low voice that never needed to be loud, because it always meant exactly what it said. You don't come to her with money problems again. Not ever. You come to me first, and I'll tell you whether we have a conversation. Emmett had stood and taken it, because there was nothing else to do, because the man was right. Lena found out about all of it on Friday evening, when Harlon came home and sat across from her at the supper table and told her. He told her simply, the way he told her most things, completely, without decoration, in the order that things had happened. He watched her face while he talked, and when he was done, he waited. Lena sat with her hands around her coffee cup and the fire going behind her, and the sound of the wind outside making the whole house feel very close and very warm. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, he agreed. I didn't. Do you wish I hadn't? She thought about it. She thought about Emmett's face on that porch, holding his hat. She thought about the written record, the formal accounting, her brothers holding the truth in their hands. No, she said. I don't wish you hadn't. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him yet. That night she went to the end of the hallway and opened the door to the cedar room and looked at the cradle for a long time. She had been thinking about Dora more than she had admitted to herself, about the baby clothes folded in the trunk, about Harlon building this house and filling it with the careful attention of someone who had intended it to hold a family, and then watching that intention go dark. She didn't go in. She stood in the doorway and looked at the cradle, and what she felt was not pity. She had decided early that pity was not something Harlon Cade needed from her or from anyone, but something closer to sorrow, the specific sorrow of a person recognizing a loss that happened before they arrived, a wound in the floor they're learning to step around. She closed the door gently. She went back to the kitchen. She poured herself more coffee and opened a book and began, slowly, to live in the house. It was Trick who brought the trouble, the way youngest brothers so often bring things, not through carelessness, but through the honest bravery of someone who hasn't yet learned that some truths need time before they can be said aloud. He rode out to the Ironwood on a Sunday in December, and he found Lena in the stable brushing down her horse, and he stood in the doorway of the stable with his shoulders tight and his hat pushed back and said, "I need to tell you something about Cass." Lena kept brushing. "Tell me," she said. What Trick told her was this. Cass had gone to Brixton's bank 2 weeks before Harlon's payment of the second note. He had gone not to make an inquiry, but to make an offer. He had offered Brixton a parcel of land, the dry north plot he'd been working, in exchange for the bank calling in Emmett's total debt immediately. Lena stopped brushing. The horse shifted its weight and exhaled. He wanted the debt called in, she said, before Harlon could offer again. Trick nodded. His face was miserable. Brixton told him no, said the land wasn't worth enough, and there were complications with the deed. But Cass, Trick stopped. "He what?" Lena said, very quietly. "He went and told Harlon's hired man, the one called Vetch, that the Ironwood's eastern fence line was cutting onto public grazing land. Which it isn't, I've seen the survey. But Vetch went and repeated it to the county assessor, and now there's a question mark on Harlon's eastern boundary. It won't hold, but it's going to cost time and money to clear it." Lena set down the brush. She stood in the middle of the stable with the cold December air coming through the planks and the horse breathing warmth against her shoulder. "Why?" she said. It wasn't really a question. She already knew. Cass had been the oldest, the one who should have been able to fix things. He had watched his father make a deal that used his sister as currency, and instead of his anger going toward his father where it belonged, it had bent, the way anger sometimes bends in people who can't bear to hate the person they love, and it had gone sideways toward Harlon. If Harlon lost standing, if Harlon's finances got complicated, if Harlon looked less solid, maybe the marriage came undone. Maybe Lena came home. It was the logic of a man who couldn't fix what had already happened, so he was trying to prevent a future he was afraid of, which was his sister belonging to someone else entirely. It was twisted and small, and it had caused real damage, and it came from love of the most suffocating kind. She told Harlon that evening. She had gotten past the idea of protecting the people in her family by hiding things from her husband. It was a bad policy, and she'd seen where it led. Harlon listened and then went quiet in the particular way he had when he was processing something that required discipline not to react to. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. She watched him hold himself still, and she thought, this is what a man looks like when he knows his own temper and has decided to be bigger than it. "He'll need to fix it," Harlon said. "The assessor question." "Yes," Lena said. He will. I won't go to him about it, Harlon said. That's for you to handle if you're willing, but it needs handling. I know, Lena said. She rode to Cass's place the next morning alone, without telling anyone she was going, in the early cold, with the frost still in the grass, and her breath making small clouds in front of her. Cass met her at the gate, because he must have seen her coming, and she could see by his face that he already knew she knew. She dismounted and stood with the horse's reins in her hand and looked at her oldest brother. This man she had grown up behind, this man who had taught her to ride and to set a fence post and to read the sky for weather. And she said, "You will go to the county assessor today and tell him you were mistaken." Cass stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the frozen ground. "And if it happens again," Lena said, "I'll be done with you." She said it without anger, just clarity, just the clean, bright line of a woman who had found her footing and intended to keep it. The blizzard came in January without enough warning. The sky went from pale and still to white chaos in under 2 hours, and by the time Harlon realized how bad it was going to be, 3 of his hired hands were already out on the eastern range with a small herd that had wandered toward the dry creek bed. He went after them without asking anyone, because that was who he was, a man who moved toward danger, because the land and the animals on it were his responsibility, and he had never once in his adult life walked away from that responsibility. Lena watched him go from the porch. She watched the snow swallow him in degrees, first his outline, then his shape, then just the sound of the horse's hooves, then nothing. The wind came up hard, and she went inside and stood at the window, and she felt something open in her chest that she hadn't expected. She felt afraid. Not the abstract, managed fear she had felt standing barefoot in the yard the day her father told her about the marriage. Real fear. Specific fear. The fear of a person who has something to lose. She stood at the window for 20 minutes while the storm thickened and the temperature dropped, and the pine trees at the edge of the yard bent like they were being punished. And then she stopped standing at the window and went to the stable and saddled her horse. She was not a foolish woman. She knew going into a blizzard alone was exactly the kind of decision that killed people in New Mexico in January. She also knew that Harlon had gone alone because he hadn't wanted to put anyone else at risk, and that this was the logic of a man who had been carrying things by himself for so long he had forgotten there was another option. She found him at the creek bed, which she knew because she knew the land by now. She had learned it the way she had learned everything, methodically and from necessity. He was there with 2 of the hands, all 3 of them working in the screaming white air to push the cattle back toward the ranch. One of the hands had his horse down. The animal had gone through a thin crust of ice over a ditch and couldn't get its legs under it, and Harlon was there with a rope and the other man, and the effort was tremendous and terrible in the cold. Lena rode in without announcing herself and went immediately to the downed horse's head, taking the bridle and speaking into the animal's ear, low and steady, the way she had been doing with frightened animals since she was a girl. The horse heard her. Its breathing changed, and in the next pull, it found its legs. They got back to the Ironwood in the last grey light before dark. The hands went to the bunkhouse. Harlon brought the horses in. Lena went to the kitchen and built the fire up and put water on, and her hands were shaking. She noticed this with a kind of removed interest, the way you notice your own body doing something you didn't instruct it to do. When Harlon came inside, he was covered in snow, and his face was raw, and his coat had gone dark with ice. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You came out," he said. "Yes," she said. She set the cup on the table and turned to face him. There was a silence that was different from all the silences that had come before it. Not the silence of two strangers learning to share a space, but the silence of two people who have just been through something real together and are still feeling the shape of it. "I was afraid," she said, "when you left." The words cost her something. She paid them anyway. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. Everything Harlon did covered distance quickly, and he sat down at the table and looked at her with those grey, watchful eyes that had watched her, she realized, from the very beginning, with something she had been refusing to name. "I would have come back," he said. "I know," she said. "I went anyway." And then, because she was Lena Voss, and she did not leave important things unfinished, "I want to open the cedar room. I want to take the cradle out. I'm not saying—" She paused, finding the words. "I'm not saying right now or soon, but I want to take it out of that room and into the house, because a house with a closed room in it is a house that's still healing, and I want this one to heal." Harlon looked at her for a long moment. His big hands were folded on the table. His face was doing that open thing again, the door someone had forgotten to close. "All right," he said. Quiet. Certain. Like a man who has just been handed back something he had stopped expecting to have. March came slowly to the valley, the way good things come when you have been waiting without certainty. Not all at once, but in increments, each one almost too small to notice, until you looked back and realized how far you'd traveled. The snow went first from the porch, then from the yard, then from the field closest to the house, the heat rising in the ground like something that had been patient all winter and was finally ready. Lena planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, something she had been planning since November, using seeds she had ordered from a catalogue and saved through the winter in a tin on the kitchen shelf. Harlon built her a raised bed from scrap timber without being asked, appearing one Saturday morning with lumber and nails and a level, spending the day on his knees in the dirt, measuring and fitting with the focused care of a man for whom this particular project held more meaning than its size would suggest. Emmett came in April. He came on his own horse this time, which had recovered, and he came in the afternoon when the light was long and golden and the new grass was showing in the pasture. Lena met him at the gate. She had known this conversation was coming. Some conversations can be felt approaching, the way you feel a change in the pressure of the air before a storm, and she had prepared herself not by planning what to say, but by deciding how she intended to feel. She intended to feel like someone who had moved forward. Not forgiven. Forgiveness was a more complicated process than a single afternoon could hold. But forward. Emmett stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, and he looked older than she remembered him, and smaller. Not smaller physically, just smaller in the way that men look when the story they've been telling about themselves has been revised by events. He said, "I should have found another way." Lena nodded. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He said, "I think about your mother. I think about what she'd have said." Lena let that sit for a moment. "She'd have said the same thing I'm saying," Lena told him. "And she'd have said it louder." There was something that might have been a ghost of a smile on Emmett's face. It didn't last. "Are you?" he started. "Yes," Lena said, before he could finish, because she knew what he was asking. "Are you all right? Are you managing? Was it survivable?" And the answer to all of those was the same answer. "I'm all right," she said. "I want you to know that. I want you to know that I am actually, genuinely all right. Not because I'm forgiving you today, but because I built something, despite what happened." She said it clearly, not cruelly, just as true as she could make it. Trick visited every week now. He had taken to making himself useful around the ranch in the way that young men with energy and nowhere particular to be make themselves useful. Fixing what's loose, riding out to check fence lines, helping in the early mornings when the work was heavy. Harlon paid him fairly and treated him like a man, which Trick, who had not always been treated that way, received with a combination of dignity and gratitude that was genuinely touching. Ford had come twice, stood on the porch both times with his lemonade he didn't drink, and on the second visit had looked at Harlon directly and said, "You kept your word," in a tone that functioned as both a statement and an apology for his earlier suspicion. Harlon had said, "Planned to." And that had been the end of it. 2 men and 2 sentences, and an understanding reached. On a warm evening in late April, Lena stood on the wide porch of the Ironwood and looked out at the valley, the mountains going dark gold and purple in the last of the sun, the cattle moving, slow and content in the lower pasture, the kitchen garden beginning to show its first green shoots along the south wall. Harlon came out and stood beside her, and she was aware, the way you become aware of things you've been knowing for a while without admitting, that she was glad he was there. Not just present, glad. The distinction mattered. She had learned the difference between what she could endure and what she could want, and she was standing in the narrow, extraordinary space between them. "Trick says Ford might come to work the ranch this summer," she said. "I heard," Harlon said. They stood in the last warmth of the day, the valley stretching out below them, enormous and alive, and full of all the things still ahead. She had been forced into this life, but what she was building inside it, that was hers. That was entirely, unshakably hers.